Chapter 4 of Alexander the Great by Ada Russell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Alexander in Thrace, Illyria, and Greece, 336 through 335 BC. When the news of Philip's assassination was brought to Athens, the citizens fell into holiday-making. Solemn sacrifice was made to the gods, and it was determined to present a golden crown to his murderer. Demosthenes laid aside the mourning which he was wearing for his daughter, newly dead, and appeared in public in a rich dress and with a garland upon his head. And his fellow townsmen, forced to pay Philip honor while he lived, now joined, with questionable taste, in insulting his memory. Demosthenes once more roused Greece, representing that it would be an easy task to throw off the yoke of the incapable child who had mounted the Macedonian throne. Nevertheless, he wrote off to the great king for aid. The child, he was 20 years of age, might have been expected to be too busy at home to interfere for some time in Greece. It was only by swift action that he secured the throne, and he and his mother were forced to offer up a holocaust of his kinsmen, including Cleopatra and her infant, a task from which a Macedonian rarely shrank. Pirates attacked the coasts, and the highland tribes took the opportunity of what they thought would be an interregnum to rise. Alexander assembled a council of his father's oldest servants, and listened attentively to the advice they gave him to leave Greece alone, establish order at home, and make himself master of the neighboring barbarians. They knew already that he was a fine soldier, but they did not yet know how fine, and they could not yet have guessed with what consummate ability he would from the first handle the political situation. But he was able to persuade them in a remarkable speech that he must act while his enemy was unprepared. The impression which a ruler makes, he told them, at the commencement of his reign, remains throughout his life. The death of my father has taken by surprise the rebels as much as myself, and we must seize the opportunity before they rally. Then he turned to account the lessons in oratory which he had learned from Anaximenes, not the least useful of lessons for a king, and addressed the populace. The king's name and person had changed, he said, but they should perceive no change in policy or rule, and he besought the Macedonians to give him the same spirits and the same arms with which they had fought for his father for so many years with so much glory. He offered large rewards for faithful service, the one use which Alexander the Great ever had for money. He appeared in Thessaly before the Greeks had any idea of his approach. He had waxed on his way from a child to a youth, he said, and Demosthenes should find him a man before the walls of Athens. Some Thessalians held the narrow pass of Tempe, where 10 soldiers could dispute the passage of an army. But Alexander turned aside and scaled Mount Ausa, cutting steps on its lofty sides, and went on his way. After this surprising feat, Thessaly submitted and paid tribute, the king exempting the city of Phia, whence his ancestor in pattern, Achilles, had come. From Thessaly he proceeded to Thermopylae, and was elected president of the Amphictyons in his father's place. Thebes and Athens made their peace, and a second congress of Corinth appointed Alexander commander-in-chief to carry out Philip's designs in Asia. Sparta alone held severely aloof, saying that it was her custom to lead, not to follow. In a suburb of Corinth took place the delightful meeting of Alexander and Diogenes. The cynic philosopher was basking in the sun in a grove of cypresses, enjoying the good things which he had preferred to a life of care and riches, when the Macedonian conqueror sought him out. Alexander asked him what form a royal favor might take, and the idle philosopher replied, "Only stand aside a little, so that you won't be between me and the sun." Astonished at this reply, and at the man on whom he in his greatness could confer nothing, the Macedonian said, "If I had not been Alexander, I would have been Diogenes." Returning toward Macedonia, he paid a visit to Delphi to have his fortune told by the priestess of Apollo. There were seasons in which the oracle, originally, perhaps, a vernal deity, was dumb, and as this was one of them, The Pythoness refused to approach the god. Alexander, however, seized her and was dragging her toward the temple, when she exclaimed, "My son, you are irresistible." He at once released her, saying that that was good enough oracle for him. Apollo had evidently gone a little out of fashion in Alexander's time, and might be treated in a sacrilegious way. When the spring of 335 B.C. came, and all was quiet at home, he set forth against the revolted Thracians. After a 10 days' march, his army came to Mount Hymus, where the Shipka Pass was occupied by a numerous Thracian army. The barbarians had surrounded themselves by a rampart of wagons, which they were prepared to roll down on the enemy. Alexander, however, directed his troops to commence the ascent, instructing the phalanx to open when the wagons came crashing down, and to let them pass, or if they had not time to do this, to throw themselves quickly to the ground with their shields over them, close together, so that the wagons would roll over the smooth metal surface. These stratagems succeeded. The perfectly trained battalions opened for the most part, and the wagons rolled harmlessly down into the valley. But even where they passed over the human railway, nobody was crushed. The Macedonians then charged the heights, uttering their fierce war cries. From their right wing a shower of arrows fell among the barbarians, while Alexander, at the head of the left wing, gained the top. The almost naked and scantily weaponed foe fled to secret hiding places, leaving 1,500 men dead on the field. Across the Balkans were congregated in arms the valiant tribes of the Tribalians, who had come from their homes in what is now Servia. As Alexander approached, they fled to an island in the Danube. This great stream, then known as the Ister, had been the limit of the Persian Empire at its widest extent, and Alexander had no idea of going beyond the Persians at this point, but he wished to terrify the barbarians by making a demonstration on the other side of the stream. Byzantium, as an ally, had sent him a few ships across the Black Sea to the Danube, and filling these with archers and heavily armed troops, Alexander sailed up the stream. There was, however, a swift, dangerous current round the island, and its steep shores made landing almost impossible for the small force in the boats, while a large army of the warlike Getae had collected on the northern bank of the river to bar his way if he should attempt to cross. He therefore withdrew and waited for nightfall. We shall hear him saying later on a great occasion, "I steal no victory." But we shall always find him stealing a victory when it is the wisest thing to do. The hides which served his soldiers for tents were stuffed with hay and stitched together to serve as boats. The simple craft of the neighboring population of fishermen and pirates were gathered together, and in the dead of the night the soldiers were conveyed over the river to a spot hidden from view of the enemy by a field of standing corn. When dawn came, the Macedonian army stood glittering in battle array by the side of the slumbering foe. The phalanx bristled with its sarissai, while on the right of it stood Alexander at the head of a matchless band of cavalry. The Getae, startled at the awful apparition, did not even wait to be attacked. They fled for their lives to their homes, and on Alexander's approach took their families to the faraway mountains. He razed their chief city to the ground, and then returned to the stream, where he offered sacrifice to Zeus the Saviour, Heracles, and the river god. Many tribes sent ambassadors to make terms with him. From the upper reaches of the Danube came envoys from the Celts, and Alexander evidently thought the moment favorable for taking down their pride. He inquired what they were most afraid of in the world, but as they heard he was leaving for Asia and felt pretty safe in their distant homes, they did not think it necessary to pay him a compliment, and replied simply that they suffered a great deal of terror from the idea that the sky would one day fall down on their heads. Alexander seems to have found no answer, and he used to say afterwards that the Celts were great braggarts. As the Macedonian army was returning homeward through Thrace, news arrived of the revolt of various Illyrian tribes subdued by Philip. A chieftain named Clytus had seized the city of Pelium, almost impregnable from the mountains and thickets that surrounded it. At the king's approach, the rebels made the primitive sacrifice to the gods of 3 boys, 3 girls, and 3 black rams, and sallied forth. Seized, however, with sudden panic at the sight of the phalanx, they retreated in haste and stood a siege in their city. Another tribe, under Glaucius, arrived to the assistance of Clytus, and Alexander found himself in a very difficult position, caught between 2 warlike forces in a wild mountainous country where the enemy held the heights. He therefore retreated, fighting his way through the enemy in his rear, and the Illyrians believed that the king had gone back to Pella. Alexander, however, recrossed the frontier one evening at dusk, fell on the united forces of the foe, and slew nearly all their number. Clytus succeeded in escaping back to Pellium, but not feeling safe there, reduced it to ashes and went into exile. News now came to Alexander of the rising of Greece. For 5 months Alexander had been absent, and the Greeks had been overjoyed to receive tidings that he had been slain by the Tribalarians. A man who pretended to have been an eyewitness of the event described the battle and showed his own wounds to the Thebans and Athenians, who at once rejected the Macedonian supremacy, while the Thebans slew some of the garrison whom Alexander had placed in their Cadmea, and besieged the rest in that stronghold. Demosthenes and the Thebans sent ambassadors to the other Grecian states, and Peloponnesian troops assembled at the isthmus. The great king sent over 300 talents to Demosthenes for war purposes. All this preparation was revealed to Alexander as he crossed into Macedonia from Illyria. He hastily marched south and appeared in Thessaly 7 days after leaving Pellium. 6 days later he encamped in Boeotia, a few miles from Thebes. Rumors had been circulated regarding the approach of the Macedonian army with Alexander at its head, but the Thebans entirely discredited such stories brought in from the countryside, and it was with horror and despair that they at last perceived Alexander's cavalry and infantry advancing across the Boeotian plain, and finally descried the form of the king on his charger. They refused his repeated summons to surrender, although he stated that he would be content with the death of their 2 leaders, and at last the Macedonian general, Perdiccas, commenced the attack, without waiting, it is said, for orders. When the fight had begun, the Macedonian garrison in the Cadmea descended to the king's aid, and after a bitter struggle the city of Epaminondas, forced at every gate, fell into the hands of the enemy. Men, women, and children, combatants and non-combatants, were slaughtered by the victorious troops. 6,000 had been slain when the order went forth for the massacre to stop. Thebes was so hated by her neighbors in Boeotia for her tyranny that it was said the Macedonians could not prevent this carnage, in which they took no part. But there are signs that Alexander wanted to give Greece a severe lesson, and he may also have thought Thebes the only city through which he had anything to fear from a military point of view. He paid Thebes the honor of wiping her out of existence. On the day following the fall of the city, Alexander summoned a congress of the Greeks to decide upon its fate. The voice of the Boeotians was allowed to rule, and the walls and the entire city of 7-gated Thebes was leveled with the ground, to the sound of flutes, after the Greek fashion, the temples alone being spared. Cassander rebuilt the city 20 years later, but the new Thebes never rose to the greatness like the old. 30,000 of the free inhabitants were sold into slavery. Those exempted, besides the priests, were a few who were known to have advocated submission to Macedonia, and those who had in former times been the hosts of Alexander or his father. Moreover, the great Emathian conqueror bade spare the house of Pindarus. Not only was the actual dwelling of the poet left standing in the general destruction of the city, but Pindar's descendants were pardoned their share in the rising. The conqueror himself was touched with pity for his victims, and never in after days refused a favor to any Theban whom he met on his travels, for exile from his city was the saddest fate which could befall men to whom even the dwellers in the next town were foreigners. Many a Theban, as he left his ruined home, must have had on his lips the words of Euripides, the poet, so dear to this generation. Ah, not that, better the end. The green grave cover me, rather, if a break must come in the days I know, and the skies be changed, and the earth below. For the weariest road that man may wend is forth from the home of his father. Athens was preparing in great panic for a siege, but she was not to receive from Alexander the treatment of Thebes. Alexander has been compared to a lion whose first fell wrath was now sated, but there was generally method behind his moods of cruelty. The one fearful example had been made, and his present task was to reconcile the Greeks to their lot. Something, too, must be allowed for the Macedonian respect for Athens. It is to the honor of Philip and Alexander that they recognized that Athens stood for all that was best in the world. Alexander hoped, almost to the end of his life, that she would be brought to sympathize with his aims. He inflicted a merely nominal punishment on her when she lay at his mercy at this time, and it was only her unchanging disapproval that made him, in the end, very bitter whenever the name of Athens was mentioned. He demanded the surrender of the orators who had addressed the people against him, and Phocion called on them to offer themselves up cheerfully for the good of their city. The orator, Demosthenes, had the invidious task of persuading the city that such a surrender was beneath its dignity. He told the people that the wolf was trying to get hold of the sheepdogs that guarded, worried, some people thought, the Athenian fold. It was decided, through Demosthenes' eloquence, to defy the king, and Athens can have little expected his forbearance. She had given an asylum to the refugees from Thebes, as she was bound in honor to do, against his express commands, and she had stopped the celebration of her mysteries to pay honor to the Theban dead. Alexander, however, moderated his demands. He would accept, he said, the exile of the orator Charidemus as a sign of submission. His offer was accepted by the unwarlike city with relief, and Charidemus went into exile. His tongue was to get him in still worse trouble at the Persian court. Even Athens had sent to congratulate Alexander on his victory at Thebes immediately after she closed her doors behind the refugees from the city, and now congratulations and spacious excuses poured in on him from all parts of Greece, except Sparta. He was at first amused when little Megara offered him her citizenship, but when he learned that no stranger since Heracles had been admitted to that honor, he graciously accepted it. He then returned to Macedonia, and prepared to set forth on the conquest of Asia in the succeeding spring. End of chapter 4.